Hello, I'm
Hi.
Kevin Chu. I'm the PM for Release. I have with me Nathan Friend, who is a super awesome engineer, and I want to get a chance to pick out all the things he learned and has thought about over the time he's worked at GitLab before we say goodbye to him. So here we are. Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, you bet.
So Nathan, just to kick things off, I have a very generic question, which is what are all the areas that you've worked on since you started at GitLab a few years ago?
Yeah, good question. So when I first started, we had just broken out release from verify. So it was still a very kind of CI focused team. And so the first feature I worked on, I think, was merge trains, building the front end for that, which is like a very CI focused feature. And we've since handed that off to verify. So release doesn't really do that, but that's kind of background. That was my first one. And then I worked on, can't remember the exact order, but I worked on a lot of things on the releases page. So that the releases page was very rudimentary when I first joined. Like it didn't have pagination. It was basically just like title and description. And so we added a lot of functionality around associating releases to milestones, release evidence. I'm trying to think what else we've added. We kind of reworked the UI. There used to be just a single releases page, and that was all there was. And now we have like an individual page for each release, and you can edit it through the UI. You can create new ones through the UI. So that was all stuff I worked on. Let's see. Oh, and then I guess most recently, the DORA metrics, all of those are, I worked on the front end for all those and helped define some of the requirements for that. So yeah, I think at a high level, that's kind of the main areas I've been involved with.
Cool. And then in terms of like having brought the direction of these three main areas, where and what area do you want to spend more time and effort on and why?
So for most of my time at GitLab, I wanted to spend my time on that releases page, which I mentioned, because it was so rudimentary when I joined, and there you almost had to do everything through the API. So we built out a lot of UI with that. But I'm actually now at the point where I think it's we're at an okay spot with that feature in terms of like editing it through the UI and stuff like that. So I think what I would focus on next, if I were still at GitLab, would be deployment and kind of managing deployments. I think that's the most interesting and kind of sorely needed feature in our product, and specifically just like thinking about how deployments are controlled through the UI and through kind of at a group level as well, because we have a lot of kind of project level features, but they don't necessarily work for big organizations. So I think that is the most, in my opinion, that would be the most value. We'd get the most value out of focusing on that as a group.
Question on orchestrating from the releases page. Right? My first thought is on workflow. And no right answer. I'm just curious to how you think about it. So in large organizations, individual teams work on individual components that are part of a larger application. It could be very well architected. So it's like everything's a service, and the service just works either independently or in conjunction with everything else. The reality in the world is nothing's ever that crisp and clean.
Yeah, absolutely.
So especially at legacy enterprises or any company that's been around for a while, it's like it's not that clean. So you run into a situation where you have a release manager type person, where that person's job is like talk to all the teams, make sure all their stuff fits together, in the right way. And when it comes to deployment, we've got to make sure A's got to go before C because D depends on B, and B can only work if this version of C works in such a way.
Yep.
In that world, how do you see, like, where does the release page fit? Is it a starting point? Like, should a release manager, before doing anything else, create a release page? If that's the case, what should be on that page that's missing today? If that's not the case, where should people start? What's natural? What an augmentation to their workflow, which is frankly completely manual from every single company I'm seeing and every customer I talk to.
Yeah.
What do you think about these type of things?
Yeah. So that's actually something we're talking about a lot before it's kind of on the release management team before we switched into door metrics. And I think the direction we were going in was creating this idea of a group release, which wasn't really a release in the same sense. So maybe that's not the best word. It's more of a release plan or, a release schedule or manage. I don't know, some kind of, it's almost a place to manage the release more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I think what at the first step was we had looked at Jupyter notebooks as kind of a release management system. And that would let you have some dynamic elements like checkboxes and be able to run scripts as part of that notebook. And then I think, thinking further, I think we had thought about even building that kind of dynamic, kind of runtime, or the ability to kind of execute steps in that plan into GitLab itself, like into the markdown. So you might have this, big release plan with checkboxes, and you can define, actions that execute when you check them. And then that would be your release plan. And it's kind of the single place that you document it and execute your release. And then that would kind of support the whole spectrum, whether or not it's fully manual and it's just kind of a static list of checkboxes that you checkbox, or if it's almost fully automated where, you click a checkbox and it runs a script that does everything. You could kind of, it's up to the user to define their release plan as they want. That's the first thing that pops in my mind when you mentioned that. And I think there's some old issues floating around about that, and maybe a few epics that might be worth looking into.
Yeah. As a developer, within a specific application group, when you hear of that, what's your reaction? I have nothing to do with this, so whatever, it's fine. That feels weird because I don't know when my stuff is going to go out. If I do know, how do I give visibility to it? Is that something of a concern to you? Jupyter Notebook, at least for me, when I think about it, it's like a tool for data scientists primarily.
Yep.
And it does make sense from a planning and scripting perspective. It's like, yeah, at the end of the day, it's just like Python. It's like an overlay on top of Python. You can do whatever you want with it. Is that like alternative to that? What are other constructs that perhaps we should be looking at for inspiration? Curious if you had any thoughts around that.
Yeah, no, I had the same thought as you, is that Jupyter, it doesn't feel like quite the right fit. I think that was our MVC, is like integrate with Jupyter notebooks and kind of allow them to take advantage of everything with that. But that wasn't really the final solution, like the best option we could come up with. I think what could be interesting is have the ability to, let's say, create this in your release plan. You have a big markdown description, and what you can do is create buttons that fire pipelines in your child projects. So you might say, okay, deploy project A, and then it goes and executes a pipeline step in the sub-project A. And then that gives you kind of that as the developer, you're still in charge of implementing how it gets released and how that pipeline works, but it's being called and orchestrated at a higher level. So you're not in charge of timing it, and you don't have to be quite as involved. That's one way that I might think about doing it.
Mm-hmm. Got it. How do you find UI important? Sorry, not UI, visual treatments of a release. I hear this from people that want this, like, oh, I want to visualize this complicated spreadsheet that I've created. Without any more details, that statement generally makes sense to me for when I first hear of it. But then when you think about it, it's like, how do you visualize something like that? Does it simply becomes another architect, a perspective on an architecture diagram? Because is it really that different? It doesn't feel like it. It's like these components all need to be deployed for this thing to work. That's an architecture diagram.
Yeah.
Is it something different? I'm curious to hear whether you've heard of anything or whether you have your own personal thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think about like visualizing the release process like itself, like like these two have to be deployed, and then that's that
More
then
like a
deploys
Gantt
this
chart.
thing. Yeah. I think that's actually one thing I think we're missing in a really big way, is any kind of like a coherent visualization of a release process. So to me, that seems super important. And I think it is a little different than an architecture diagram, because it's more like it's more of a process and more of a time flow rather than just organization. So yeah, I think that's actually one of the things I think we're missing in a huge way, is just the ability to see how a release moves from first of all being a release, like being merged by a developer, and then moving through all the process, and then finally being deployed in production. I kind of, in my head, I can't remember which system, I think it might be Octopus Deploy, but they have these nice, you see all the environments, and it's kind of a defined flow, like first gets auto deployed to dev, and then maybe auto deployed to QA, and then you kind of manually drag it from QA into staging, and then you manually drag it to prod, and there might be an approval stage in the middle, and you can see all that visually like a timeline view. And I think that's really cool, and that fits a little nicer with the release manager persona, because they're not necessarily going to want to like a super technical like GitLab CI YAML format isn't really what they're looking for.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned earlier you're excited about deployment, and I really like your thinking around deployment should be like, if we had an opinionated way about how things should work, it'll be everyone creates their code, and then you orchestrate it into a group release, and then underneath that group release there's individual project level releases, and that release just rubber stamp of the thing that's going to potentially get moved into some environment.
Yeah.
And there's a flow. So if you don't have a rubber stamp, perhaps it's like the time of deployment, it gets stamped somewhere, and that's your retroactively you create a release. So you can still go back and access the page, which would be really nice. Because like if there's, I was thinking, I don't know if you said any of this, but you may have, I don't remember. It's like, if you look at the environment, the latest deployment is what's in theory should be what's out there today. It'd be great if even you don't have a step where in your process that says create a release, but you can click on that latest deployment. That just takes you to the release page, because even if you don't create it ahead of time, you still created it. The system's able to create that for you. You have all the notes, all the associated issues, etc. So like,
Yep.
no matter which way you go, backwards or forward, that whole chain is there.
Yep.
That creates all sorts of like traceability, and just visibility into the process. That to me would be super cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, and that's, I would almost go so far, like right now you can, when you deploy, it's kind of up to the developer to define how they get their code and how it deploys to an environment. I would almost go so far as say, like, we were strict at a system level. You deploy a release, like you create a release, and then you have to source your files from that release when you deploy. And because that would give you the traceability that you want, where you can definitively say this environment is running release 1.5. And then, like you said, you can link back to it and you can see the release evidence and you know exactly what's in it. I think that would, yeah, exactly what you said that's kind of what I'm in my vision as well.
Okay. So we talked about several like big ticket items. Where would you start if you had a choice? And would you have any reasons to have that opinion?
Yeah, I think what I would focus on first is associating deployment of releases with deployments, or releases with environments, kind of one and the same. Because right now they're really completely separate concepts. Like we have releases, and then completely separately we have environments. And that association would really enable a lot of the future features we want. So I think that would be the first thing I'd implement if I was building all the stuff we just talked about. And you wouldn't have to do it exclusively yet. Like you wouldn't have to say environments only can deploy a release. Like you can keep deploying as you are, but yeah, that association optionally is added in.
That makes sense. And this will be it has to start at the project level, right? This wouldn't be a group level thing to start with.
Yeah, in my head, that's just a project level feature.
Going back to what you said about group releases earlier, really is a coordination thing. We should probably come up with a better name for it, because when you say group releases, at least when I've seen that word before, I mistakenly think that it's just a mashup of multiple releases, but that's not quite what it is.
Yeah, right. No, you're totally right. And so that's why I don't know if release is the best word. Maybe, yeah, release plan, or yeah, coordination, right? Yeah, something like that. Something to indicate it's not actual code. It's not like a snapshot of code like an actual release. It's just managing that.
Okay. I want to talk about release evidence slightly. My knowledge is very non-existent here. From what I understand, release evidence, all it is a JSON blob. And how you access that JSON blob is you can click it on the release page, but that blob really doesn't offer additional details than what's on the page. So why is this distinction between, actually, my first question is, why do we just serve the release page from the JSON blob, from the release evidence? Is it the same data, or is it separate? There's information both stored in the DB as well as we create the separate JSON thing.
That's a great question. I actually am not the best person to talk about this because this was a feature that I think Sean Carroll did most of the back end, and I think Jake did most of the front end. So
Okay.
unfortunately, I didn't actually work with this one very much. I'm trying to remember what's in it. I think it's like a list of, I think it's basically kind of a snapshot of the release object, like everything that's in the database
At a certain point.
at a certain point in time. Yeah.
Which is interesting because we have other issues saying, hey, I don't want you to change association to issues in a release ever, which
Yeah.
is kind of the purpose of the release evidence, but people want to feel like they want to genericize release overall to be some point to become an immutable thing.
Right. Yeah, and which it kind of makes sense to me. Like you kind of want, you kind of want that, like if you want the release to be a snapshot, and just like it's a snapshot of the code, you kind of want anything else associated with it to also be a snapshot. It's like kind of the state of the system when it was released.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, sorry, I can't give you a super detailed like rundown of that feature.
It's okay. At the end of the day, I don't think there's a difference, but I haven't run into anybody with a strong opinion that says yes, they should be different.
Yeah.
Still looking for that person if that person exists.
Right.
Yeah, because like at the end of the day, I think the distinction really is whether this thing has been deployed already, the release. Once it's deployed, it becomes a release becomes immutable because you don't want to change history to say something that wasn't work. But up to the time of deployment, of course, you're still working on it. You can add release notes, you can add issues. Oh, this thing's in and out, have a discussion. It's only after you deploy where the need to make sure your records don't change becomes an important element.
Yeah.
Which makes your point about associating deployments to releases being the first step. That makes total sense because like, how do you know a release is released? You don't unless there's that record somewhere that we can like, oh yeah, we created this foreign key to this deployment or whatever it is. At that point, you can programmatically actually like lock things down or change the treatment of the UI or whatever it is that we want to do.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. That makes sense. What else did you think about that I didn't ask you?
Yeah. So I have like a list of like it's almost like a wish list of things that I would build if I had infinite time. The disclaimer is that I don't know if these are like valuable things, but these are just the things that I would want to work on if I had the time.
Yeah.
So I shared that document with you. So the first one is making releases a little more automatic and less explicit. So right now, if you want, as a user, if you want to use releases, it's like you have to go out of your way to create them. Either create them manually, or you have to go in and define your GitLab YAML file with the release keyword so that they get auto-created. It requires some kind of effort on your part, as the user.
But it's all like work that probably to the user they don't see immediate value. It's like, why do I want to do this?
Yeah. And I think there's an opportunity for GitLab to detect and auto-create releases, and specifically, if we could do that using there's this concept of semantic commits. So you embed in the commit message yourself as a developer. You say what kind of change it is, and there's a project called Semantic Release which ties into those, and we'll read those and then create releases automatically based on those commits. And so at the moment, you can integrate with that package, and you can kind of build that as a pipeline step. But we could actually take it a step further and build that functionality into GitLab itself. So there's basically zero setup. You could have, create a brand new project with a brand new repository, and you begin committing with semantic commits, commit messages, and automatically GitLab would start creating releases based on those messages. And that would be really cool, because then that would, I think a lot more projects would use releases because it would be so easy to get started with them. And then that would kind of, if it would make the funnel a lot bigger for people to begin using releases and begin using environments and all the other things that are connected with releases. So that would be something I think would be really cool.
That would be awesome. And I've never heard, thank you for sharing about semantic release. I never even thought about or heard about any of this. Looks like a super popular project.
It is, yeah. Yeah, particularly with like Node JavaScript, but there's nothing specific to JavaScript that's like the project is written in JavaScript. That's kind of why it's popular in those circles, but it's very language agnostic. So
the concept makes a lot of sense, because like at the end of the day, versioning and releases are at least parallel concepts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're using it once again. You're using your Git history as the single source of truth. So now you're pulling in, like, not only is it all my versions and snapshots, but it's also my deployment, or not deployment, all my release history can be determined through my commit messages. So it's pushing more and more for Git to be the single source of truth, which is, I think, really awesome.
Yeah. This is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, anyway, that's my first one. And then the next one is kind of related. So it's making releases aware of semantic versioning. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the other one, because semantic release creates semantically versioned releases. And what that means is, you have those 3 version numbers, like major, minor, patch, that you see people using that schema when they're versioning. Right now, GitLab, you can use that as your tag names, and GitLab was fine with that, but it doesn't infer anything off those numbers. And if GitLab could actually parse those tag names or version numbers, it would open up some possibilities. For example, we could say, even if you say, let's say you release version 1.0, 1.2, 1.3, and then you have a bug fix for the very first version, so 1.1.1. At the moment, GitLab would just show those in chronological order, because it's just the order that you created it. But if GitLab could understand the semantic version between the different releases, we could actually sort them by version number, which would be really, really powerful. And you could also order them. You would say, okay, I know the next major version after this release is this next release, or the next minor release is this one. And it would give the system of GitLab a lot more understanding of the order of the releases. Yeah,
makes sense. So, for example, a release manager persona could, we all know about version 2.0 way ahead of time. So that might get created much earlier than 1.2 patch number 364.
Yes, exactly.
But right now, because of our limitation based on only time, it's like,
yeah, it's just a big list, right? Yeah. So it's not the most valuable. And I see that being valuable too if we go forward with like making nice workflows for deployment. We could say, okay, we can auto deploy to production if it's a minor release or a patch release, but maybe major versions require approval.
Yeah, you
that
can
kind of thing.
All sorts of rules.
Yeah, because that semantic version tells you a lot about what's in the version and how risky it is to deploy. So there's a lot of other ways that could be used.
Yeah, like breaking changes, have more eyeballs on here.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Okay.
So that's that's another one. We kind of already talked about making releases a source for deployments, so that instead of kind of sourcing it at the moment, when you do a deployment job, you just get the project repository at a certain snapshot, and then it's up to you to like compile and build them and release it. But I think it would make a lot more sense if deployments always start with releases. So you have a CI pipeline that ends in a release, and that's kind of like, this is ready to go. And then you have almost a separate pipeline that takes that release as an input and then deploys that to an environment. So I don't know. I don't have a great idea of what that should look like. Like, it could look, in the most extreme form, it could be a whole separate pipeline view and even a separate GitLab file, like a GitLab CI file. That might be too dramatic, I don't know, but some kind of separation between the two.
I have seen like issues where either we ourselves are proposing or a community member proposes, hey, can you separate out the CD part from the CI part?
Yeah.
Why do you think it's too dramatic? Curious.
I don't necessarily think it's too dramatic. Well, I don't know. I think it's a
very different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it is. And it would just be there'd be a lot of considerations that have to go into like what that would look like. And it would be hard to do an MVC of it. I think that's maybe my resistance to it, is it would be hard to do in a GitLab way where we build small pieces. But I don't think that means it's wrong. Like, I think that could be a valid approach. I just don't know exactly where I'd start with it. But cool. Yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of things we would have to think through.
Exactly.
Nice. And then
yeah. So let's see. That was number 3. Number 4, make deployment workflows a first-class citizen. So my thinking behind this is that we've gotten by for quite a while by just building features on top of CI, and that's worked great. And I think this is true of more than just us. I think it's for all of GitLab.
Yep.
Yeah, we have this really awesome CI system, and then we kind of see that as it's every new feature we think of first building it on top of CI, and that's not always the best user experience. And I think that's the case with CD, like all of our release features. Currently, it's really just embedded in CI. And I'd love to see more kind of seeing release features as its own concepts separate from that of CI. And that's kind of related to the previous one, I guess, like having a separate release workflow page that's not just a pipeline view, it's like a release pipeline view, and having an actual like approval system for approval workflows. Right now we have manual jobs, which is, we kind of get by with that with CI, but they're not quite what we want. So yeah, just having a more, not being afraid to build out our own release features is kind of what I've been thinking with that one.
I totally agree, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the last one is, so right now we have the concept of a package, and we have the concept of a release. And I think part of that's because they're two separate teams, and there's so much crossover between those two concepts. And I think we could go as far as combining them into a single concept, because I can't really think of too many cases where you create a package and that's not a release. Like, that's almost by definition, creating a package is a release of the software in some form.
Because the end of the end output when you're creating a package is it's a representation of a combination of code and configuration, whatever else that works. So, and then you stamp it with version blah blah blah.
Exactly.
You might have notes on what's changed in this package. What is that? That was 100% overlap with the release.
Yeah, exactly.
But the difference perhaps is like, and we also have like, this concept of different language have different package repositories, but then we also have a generic package repository. Why is that different from a release?
Right.
Perhaps maybe like the only thing I could think of is like external versus internal use. Whereas like external use is like a package, publicly available in some form, package repositories. Like you don't have to be intimately involved with. You're not working on that thing yourself. Whereas release, perhaps there's this connotations like this is the thing I'm working on. But maybe that really has no bearing.
Yeah, it could be, and there might be some other things that I'm not thinking of that would differentiate the two. But at the very least, I think there's a lot more that at the very least they could be associated a lot more closely. Right now, there's virtually no association. One of the benefits I think for GitLab as a company is that there's a lot of features that we end up kind of building in parallel. I don't know, even in that one feature about having a release as an input to a pipeline, I think Tim commented, oh, we're thinking about doing the same thing for packages because a package could be an input to a pipeline. And so it'd be great to be able to build that once and have it work for either. And then it's also a little bit confusing as an end user. Like, do I create, if I have, I finished my package, do I also create a release for it? And what's the benefit of that? Or do I have to create both? Yeah. It's just kind of a duplicate concepts that we could gain some, we could eliminate some duplication.
Okay. Nice. Thank you for this list. This is great. I will probably be referencing it for years. Switching gears. So you've been through a few reorgs and shifting of team members. I feel like when we combine two, actually, hold on. I'm gonna stop recording.